Okay, welcome everyone to this seminar titled How Can Finance for Climate Change Adaptation Be Spent More Effectively? A bit provoking title, and I'm not saying we will come up with a solution, but we have started the journey of trying to understand this. My name is Esben Friis Hansen. I'm a senior researcher here at DIIS and coordinator of the GAP program, Governing Adaptation Finance for Transformation. We are midway in the program now. We are 2 years into the program. We have another 2 years. And we've just come from a 1 week retreat where we made status and ready to move on. Yesterday, Politiken came with a front page like this, with I've never seen a front page like that. Well, they're certainly saying with very big letters that we have now experienced El Niño and it's been a shock, and you have to have these shocks before you start acting. They had these shocks for at least a decade in Africa, and I've worked with climate change adaptation for the last decade in various programs, and I've been every year around in rural Africa, talking to farmers, seeing, and I would say little or nothing has happened on the ground. Farmers are still struggling, increasingly not knowing when the rainy season starts and whether there's a mid-term drought. The unreliability of rainfall patterns is a fact of life for farmers today, and livelihoods of pastoralists are getting more and more unbearable or impossible for them to continue, and yet they're on their own. Local governments are doing very little to facilitate them to adapt, and what they're doing is often not relevant to relating to local priorities. There's quite a lot done, but decisions are taken far away, and what's happening on the ground is often not well aligned with local priorities. So that's really where why we came up with this program, to try to understand what happens with this $83 billion, which we are up at the $100 billion we promised in the Paris in 2015. The northern countries promised to pay annually for climate change mitigation and adaptation to developing countries. We have now reached 83 billion, but perhaps even more importantly, how are they used? What kind of effect do they have on the ground? And so the starting point for the GAP program is this what we perceive as a gap between decision making and action, and we have a hypothesis that devolved governance of climate change adaptation finance will lead to a less skewed spatial distribution of these resources and better use of these resources. So we have 2 work packages, we have 3, but here we're only focusing on 2 of them. One where we follow the money. We followed a range of $7 billion the last decade flowing through the systems in Tanzania and Kenya. So we map the flow of financial resources allocated from donors and central governments to implementing institutions on the ground for climate change adaptation. And then secondly is more related to political economy. We explore the influence of socio-political context surrounding the flow of adaptation funds. And I'm very happy to present a really excellent team of people. It's been we are having a truly collaborative devolved governed research program where we are 10 senior researchers from Tanzania, Kenya, and Denmark, and 4 PhD students. Really, we are quite specialized, but we cover the governance and public finance management and down to anthropology. So we have a wide interdisciplinary team, and we have many years of experience on the ground. And we're actually the first to try to do this seriously, follow the money. It's big organizations like IIED have long said that only 10% of the money reach the local level, but it's really not based on data. It's based on analysis of 2% of the flow. So I think it's also complicated, but it's interesting to try to follow the money. So and more the political context of how they are flowing. So let me introduce the program. We're only halfway, so we are in the middle of many of the studies. So this is foremost to give the 4 PhD students a chance to come up with their case studies. And first, we are setting the scene. Hans-Peter Dijgaard, who worked many years especially for donor organizations and NGOs, he will set the scene on the global flow of finance and how this finance is reported and composed. This will follow up with Per Tidemann, who will report from a study we've done about devolution of to what extent this funding based on analysis of OECD data, how far this funding is reaching through the government systems, and set the scene for subnational governance and financial arrangements. That is the decentralization in Tanzania and Kenya, and look at the OECD data. This will be followed by the first of the PhD students, Millicent Umala, who will talk about coordination, and stakeholder perception, and political economy, and foremost point out that climate change finance is a political process, and discuss the politics of political economy of climate change policy implementation in Kenya. And that is already out in an article, our first article published. Secondly, this is followed by Beatrice Sumari, who will also look at how central government in Tanzania is exploring power and control over the process of climate change adaptation finance, and how it's extending its control in a highly centralized manner all the way out to the village on how funding is used. And in Tanzania, we have a case where virtually all decisions are taken centrally and not really well related, aligned with local priorities. But on the other hand, we have a very well established decentralization system that could be used. Then we'll have a short break, 15-minute coffee break, and it will be followed by Peter Rogers, who will look at central government governance in Tanzania, central government led, and follow the financial flows through the Tanzanian system, and tracing the $1.7 billion which flow to climate change adaptation in Tanzania, 2014 to 22. So partly the flow of funding, but also the governance of these funds. And another 15 minutes will then be given to Judith Mulva, the second Kenyan PhD student, who will talk about the political economy of devolved climate change adaptation in Kenya, where we've had the Constitution 2010, which gives a much more devolved governance system, and that is beginning to come through with climate change adaptation, and there is especially the very big new flagship FLOCA, the World Bank program based on devolved governance. But Judith will go more into details on that one. And finally, we'll wrap up this flow of words from this side with Jamal Msani from Repoa in Tanzania, who will talk about political economy of devolved governance of climate change adaptation in Tanzania on a more broad political scale. And then you will have the words. You will have 35 minutes, which will be facilitated by Eric Kyoko from our partner from Kenya. 30 minutes Q&A, and then we'll invite you for sandwiches outside, and you can mingle with the researchers if you are interested. Thank you very much. That was even less than my 15 minutes, but I'll hand over the words to Hans Peter, who will go through the main figures of climate change flow in the world. Thanks. Left, I will do something with the. There's 1 minute left.
Yeah. Can you hear me now? From the microphone? Yes? No? Ja. Men jeg har lige, den er jo på. 1, 2, 3.
Ja, den er der.
Jeg skal bare higher volume. Ja. Yes. Vi har lige haft Afrika har lige haft et Africa Union. Africa just ended Wednesday as the first ever climate summit in Nairobi and they made all the governments in Africa agreed on the Nairobi Declaration on climate change and call to action. And when you read these pages, finance is among the most prominent issues. And when I have participated in all the COPs in COP 15 and now COP 21 in Paris, 2015, the Paris Agreement, and also was in the failure in the Bella Center in 2009, COP 15. I would say climate finance is always among the four top priorities, also in this declaration from the African leaders. I will start with the OECD data, which is normally published in a report to the one COP. OECD come up with figures from the big database, where, for instance, Denmark is sending the DIIS is about 100 project per year, which is reported with Rio markers that they had adaptation or had mitigation Rio marker. And that is something 2.5 or 2.8 billion Danish kroner, 2,8 milliarder danske kroner, to climate finance reported to OECD, also reported to European Union and to UNFCCC. That means the Secretary Bond, biannual reports every 2 years. Denmark and all the other countries report to the UN, United Nations. This is from the OECD report. Mobilized private is, some of you know IFU, how IFU can use Danish pension funds, private money from the pension funds. So IFO is mobilizing private pension funds, for instance. That's the one. The surprise in these private mobilized is not really, it increased a lot 2015-16 up to 17, and can you see it's basically not, I'm sorry, this one, the 10, 14, 14, 14 even decreased a little bit. I guess many of you have heard these big speeches about the trillions, go from the billions to the trillions with the private sector, but it's not really happening. And I think that probably be one of the topics for the UN General Assembly. They have a midterm review of the SDG goals for 2030, and I think that will be one of the debate, where is the private sector's increase. Then we have export credits, as among them in Denmark with windmills from Vestas. Multilateral, that is the multilateral is particularly the World Bank, Africa Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the big development banks. They are increasing, can you see, from 7 up to 36. So the big increase these days have been with the multilaterals, including the World Bank. And then the bilateral public, that means like Danida, CEDA, NORAD, DFID, all the... they also increase, but you can see it's relatively little from 28 to 31. So the big increase is the multilaterals. But we still, the target from Bella Center was $100 billion per year from the year 2020. Here we have 2020. The first year we have from the agreement, a Paris Agreement started in 2020 on finance. We are still only at 83 billion out of the 100. And that's a big frustration among the developing poor countries. Why can't the rich countries not even deliver $100 billion per year? Yes, this research, gap research, is focusing on adaptation. And now the global figure, this is also from the OECD, is about 33% is for adaptation, and well, almost 59 is going to mitigation in the year 2020. The Paris Agreement has a formulation saying balanced, and most of us and also the international NGOs have understood balanced as 50%, so 50 billion for mitigation, 50 billion for adaptation. COP26 in Glasgow realized that much more needs to be done on adaptation, because it was still down to about 20. If you saw before, it was about 20 billion out of the 83, only 20 for adaptation. So it's much lower than mitigation. It's already over 50, the 50%. So there was a strong decision in the Glasgow decision to double adaptation finance from this about 20 billion in 2019 to 40 billion in 2025. It's an enormous increase, and it will be very difficult to let that happen in so few years. Also because it should also be a bit quality. It can not only be quantitative increase. So a strong decision from the COP26 confirmed last year in Egypt in COP27, and we will soon have the Dubai COP28 in December. I think maybe because we had the Bella Center and the text came out with this new and additional finance beyond the development aid, the ODA development aid. That was already in the 2009 Bella Center agreement, but that's not really happening, and that's maybe something where particularly CARE Denmark have been very aware about this formulation about new and additional. John Norbo, you might have heard from CARE, is a strong voice in that. And CARE also tried to promote that among the international NGOs called Climate Action Network, CAN. There's a report here, you're not really allowed to see it because it will be launched 20th of September 2023, but I did that. I have 2 people working with me on all these Excels and analysis. And Andrew, he went through all the donor countries, wrote 2 pages about each country, about was it new and additional since 2009, and is it 0.7% of the DNI, and all these considerations. The basic conclusion is there's almost not almost not any new and additional. So almost all the climate finance is development aid. And that's documented in this report that CARE will launch in New York at the UN. 20th of September is the top level day on climate change in New York. One we have done for several times is Oxfam International's climate finance shadow report. It came back we did from 2018, we did with Oxfam also 2020, and now we was launched in June in Bonn, the 2023 shadow report. It's in many ways a shadow report to OECD climate finance report. You'll later get access to a link if you want to download the report. And that's one of the things with my team, we work with Oxfam and CARE International and the church, Dan Church, the ACT Alliance, the church organizations, and they are all very good on handling media contact and communication with media. So many of our reports have been in The Guardian. Fiona, she get this report a week before, and then she write about, in this case, the shadow report. So that's really nice to have this press coverage. One of the big issue where Oxfam have been a bit the lead among international NGOs is the issue on instruments. Is this climate finance given by grants, which is, for instance, Denmark basically only report grants to the OECD and United Nations, but many other countries also provide a lot of loans. A country like France, about 90% of French climate finance is loans and only 10% is grants. So France want the money back. So that's something where at the worldwide, globally, 26% last figures was as grant, provided as grants. 31%, 20 billion was as concessional loans. Concessional loans is when you have development aid, you are allowed to count, of course, the grants, but you can also count concessional loans. For instance, when Denmark has some windmill in parks in Ethiopia, or it can often be concessional loans. It was like in old days in Denmark for the students' study loan. You got subsidized low interest rates, concession. There's very low interest rates. It's very close to 0% interest rates, but they still have to repay back. And then I think that's a shocking. That's where we really, with Oxfam International, have tried to make awareness in the world, have been the non-concessional loans. Non-concession means they are not regulated by these OECD rules for how you calculate concessional loans. So the interest rate is considerably bigger. And in the last shadow report is box number 3. We made a calculation of a non-concessional loan. It's much more difficult to calculate than the concessional ones. We calculated a 400 million US climate loan to Philippines taken in the World Bank. And for many years, as a boligloan, loans in Denmark have been close to 0%. That was also the case with the US Federal Reserve, the US central banks. There was also about 0% interest rate for 10 years. And then since March 2022, they start increasing for fighting inflation. And today the US Federal Reserve is more than 5%. And then you get a management and risk fee over, that's 1.5%. So now Philippines have to pay 6.5% in the interest rate on this 400 million US dollar loan. And I calculated that means that they will increase the repayment with 40%. So with this increase in the central bank's interest rates, now it costs Philippines 40% more for repayments. And that goes a little bit for the issue on foreign debt, and that's also a case in like a country like Ghana is heavily with foreign debt in Ghana, and we will also look now with Tanzania and Kenya, how is the situation? Yeah. A good thing is that OECD made a new reporting directive, it's called from 2016. So from 2018 we can see how much a concessional loan, how much of it is a grant element, and how much is in basic to pay back to the France or who else. And we found out it's really different from country. That's a table from the shadow report. But we found an average of 55% is grant, so that means they have to pay back the 45% of the loan. So more or less half of these loans should, in our views, not be counted for the 100 billion, the global goal, because they counter the face value. So if the 400 million to Philippines, they count the 400 million as part of this international goal for the 100 billion US dollars. But in this Oxfam shadow report, we will argue they should only be counted 55 or half of it. So 200 billion should be counted, not 400 billion. So that's a strong point that Oxfam really have been good on writing on concessional loans. And we just looked at how much of the climate finance for Tanzania and Kenya is with instruments. And it's quite clear here that Kenya have more debt, more loans than 60%, and Tanzania have 40%. So we can see that, and maybe it also have something to do with the increase in income per capita in Kenya. They're now going to be a middle income country, so that will imply more loans and less grants. But that's something we can go further on to look at what happened with the loans, particularly in the 4 resource areas in the 2 countries. That is, we have our great PhD students going out very much in the field. So to look also at some of the projects, we have discussed now in Møn that we will look at the 40 biggest projects in Kenya and the 40 biggest in Tanzania, and then go into the project documents and then pick some of them and make fieldwork and interviews and so on. And some of them should definitely also be loan projects from Africa Development Bank or the World Bank. Yeah, this is a declaration, this one from the Nairobi declaration from Wednesday. I found as considerable issue about financing, and this is a president of Kenya. And one of the section is talking about multilateral development banks, MDBs, capitalization and deployment reform. There's a discussion to reform the development banks so they can offer more and cheaper loans to the countries for climate. And increasing availability, concessional capital. That means it could be understood they want more of the non-concessional loans to be concessional, because they have somewhere in the declaration saying we want to lower from 8% interest rate to the 4%, 8 to 4%. So, and that will make it more concessional. It's a kind of subsidizing loans. And improve the debt management also. Yeah, so I think that there's a big thing also for the COP28 in Dubai. Yeah, and the last you'll be able to get links to some of the reports my small Inca team have made for Oxfam and CARE International. That's it, Esben.
Thank you very much for keeping the time and giving us this overview of our international climate finance. I'll invite Per Tidemand to continue with the next on devolved climate adaptation finance in Kenya and Tanzania, where we specifically have looked at OECD flow to Tanzania and Kenya.
Can you hear me? Is this mic on fine? Yeah. So I'll follow up from the presentation from Hans Peter and use the same type of data set, the OECD data on climate change finance, with particular emphasis on adaptation and particular emphasis on Kenya and Tanzania, and looking at the extent to which it has been devolved. It's based on a working paper that we jointly developed. Most of the team that is working on this program was involved in one way or another. in particular the PhD students did most of the donkey work on analysis of some preliminary analysis of project documentation. So what I talk about is just briefly a bit about the emerging discussion about what governance aspects of finance, of adaptation finance actually matters. As Esben introduced when he introduced our research topic, he emphasized that much of the discussion to date has been about the numbers, the amount of money, and that was also what Hans-Peter was talking about. But our interest is really about going into discussion about the quality of the adaptation finance, what financing arrangements matters. So we start, this paper is starting that discussion. And one of the things that is emerging in the discussion is the importance or relevance of having more predictable finance, having more devolved finance that involve the local communities so that they can get engaged. And in order to understand that, how that can play out in Kenya and Tanzania, we'll talk a bit about the subnational governance arrangements in these two countries, because obviously you're not implementing that in a vacuum. You have to understand the national institutional context. And then we'll talk about the analysis of the OECD data that is available, the OECD data on what all development partners is providing for adaptation finance in these two countries. And then finally a few thoughts about what we have learned from that exercise. So there's some increasing consensus in among some development partners and local organizations about the importance and relevance of having locally led adaptation. The basic premise is that climate change impacts are highly localized, and therefore it's important that local solutions to the effects of climate change is being facilitated. And that there have been some different fora that have endorsed different types of good governance principles. One is the locally led adaptation principles adopted by the Global Commission on Adaptation. And they emphasize the importance of devolving decision-making to the lowest appropriate level, and various issues regarding having flexible financing, transparency and accountability, investing in local capacities, etc. And what we have started to look at is whether climate change adaptation finance at the moment in these countries comply with these principles. One of the foremost principle is the emphasis on devolution of decision making, and that implies adherence to some principles of decentralization through devolution to local governments, elected democratic local governments seen as being permanent structures that can articulate the need of local citizens to a greater extent than other institutions. This emphasis on the importance of devolution is also based on the fact that within the OECD, the European Union and OECD countries generally, the OECD have done some analysis of climate change adaptation finance in Europe and OECD, and they come to the conclusion that around 63% of climate significant public expenditures are managed by subnational local governments. So in our part of the world, it's typical that adaptation finance is being managed at subnational level, and that's obviously also driving the concerns about how these climate adaptation funds in practice are being managed internationally. Before looking at how the adaptation funds are being managed, it's by local governments in the two countries. It's useful to have a brief comparison of Kenya and Tanzania about of how the subnational governance structures in generally are operating. As you might know, in Kenya there was, after the recent new constitution, there's a completely new set of subnational governance structures that were put in place. And in Kenya they have scrapped all the old local governments, and they have empowered democratically elected counties. They are very, very big entities with an average population of around 1.4 million per county, compared to, as you know, a local government population in Denmark of around 50,000, and in Tanzania a population per local government of around 320,000 on average. In Tanzania, the local government institutional structures are not uniform like in Kenya. You have relatively big district councils, you have fairly big city councils, and then you have smaller municipalities and quite small town councils spread across the country. So they vary a lot in size and capacities. In Kenya, they're huge. In Kenya, there are no formal structures of local governments below the county level. So the county is the only real subnational structure. But in Kenya, each county is allowed to establish its own structures as they deem fit. And we have some interesting cases in some of the counties where fieldwork have been undergoing, where they are creating independent authorities to manage certain aspects of climate change adaptation, of natural resource management, of local taxation, etc. Whereas in Tanzania, there is a very fine network of subnational structures. There's more than 10,000 village governments that are formal local governments that are empowered to make decisions on a number of issues regarding management of natural resources, etc. So this is a quite different local government structure. The main difference probably in terms of structures between the two countries is probably the degree of autonomy in Kenya compared to Tanzania. In Kenya, the functions and the powers of the local government system is very clearly articulated in the constitution. So not something that the central government can overrule easily. The rights, the functions and powers are very clearly outlined. They are responsible for a wide range, basically all basic services except education, whereas Tanzania local governments also have to deal with basic education, primary and secondary education. When it comes to the assignment of particular functions that are mainly relevant for climate change adaptation, like management of water, agriculture, rural development, then there are, according to legislation, there are broadly the similar assignment of functions. But in Tanzania, there's been some recent centralization of particular water and rural roads that have been centralized to independent authorities under the central government. When it comes to financing, then there are also very significant differences. The budget of local government on average in Kenya is significantly higher than in Tanzania, around $64 per person, whereas in Tanzania it's only $48 per person to cover all local services. In Kenya, the share of total public sector revenue is a bit lower than in Tanzania because of the bigger size of the economy and public sector in Kenya. The composition of revenue is roughly similar. a balance between 10% own source revenue taxes and 90% transfers. But the big difference is the extent to which funding is earmarked. In Kenya, at least 90% of the budgets of local governments are completely non-earmarked. So local government can decide on whether to spend the money on something that's relevant for climate adaptation or not. Whereas in Tanzania, the amount of money that the local government really can decide on in terms of sector budget prioritization is very small and less than 5% on average. There's also, if you look at the expenditure pattern, there's quite some differences. In Tanzania, the biggest sector is basic health services. But in Tanzania, it's the education sector. Because in Tanzania, every school teacher is paid through the local government, secondary and primary. So 60% of the budgets in local government in Tanzania is going to payment of particularly teachers, but also management of classrooms and provision of that services. Whereas that service is not accounted for at all in the Kenya local governments. The share funds of which we can that are allocated to sectors that are of main relevance for climate change adaptation, like water, roads, natural resource management, etc., is roughly twice as high in Kenya as in Tanzania. Now, that was the all institutional arrangements and financing patterns of local governments in the two countries. Now we look at climate change adaptation finance, and we look at the same data set that Hans Peter was talking about. So that is from OECD in the period from 2013 to 19, where we look at how much money are, according to OECD, being allocated to Tanzania and Kenya. And in Tanzania, it was over that period around $2.1 billion. In Kenya, much more, $3.3 billion, and slightly less than 700 projects in each of these countries in the database. In Kenya, credits are more important than in Tanzania. And in both countries, it's the World Bank and African Development Bank that are the most important funders of climate change adaptation, if you look at the big statistics. Now then, our team tried to analyze at least the 40 biggest projects and in each of these countries, and if you just pick the 40 biggest, then in Kenya you will capture $2.56 billion. So that is by far more than half, around 75% of total funding, by looking at those 40 biggest projects. And in Tanzania, a similar percentage. Then what we did was to look at the extent to which these huge projects were in any way captured in the national budget as being classified in the vote of subnational entities, or being captured in the accounts of the subnational entities. That was a very basic analysis, but more stringent than what was done in the past by the IAD. They only looked at the global green fund, which is a very small, percentage of total adaptation finance, and they didn't have a strict definition for how to select, or how to determine whether funding is reaching local government level. Now that is a bit surprising difference. When we started the research, we thought, okay, Kenya is an example of a devolved system, and we would assume that the donor finance is following the national system and the national architecture for financing. And whereas we thought that Tanzania is relatively deconcentrated, at least in the recent years, so we would not find such a big amount being reflected in the budgets of the adaptation projects in Tanzania. Then when we started looking more closely at those projects that we classified in this manner as partially devolved, we also find that to a large extent there's an overestimate of climate change adaptation in the statistics, that there's a lot of old wine in new bottles. Many of these projects have adaptation as a secondary objective that is not very explicit in terms of how it's actually addressing climate change adaptation. The interventions might be broadly relevant for climate change adaptation. In Tanzania, for instance, the biggest single project, which is around, in the OECD database, accounted for around $365 million of climate change adaptation finance, was the Tanzania Productive Social Safety Net. That, if those of you who have been working in Tanzania, you would recall that that's an old project, used to be called TASAF, and still being recorded in some of the budgets as TASAF. It's essentially a social safety net, cash transfers and public sector work for like food for work program, etc., where they have tacked a significant amount of being climate change adaptation. There's also traditional urban projects like Tanzania Strategic Project is being classified as climate change adaptation, and I was involved in the design of that project, and I remember when we designed it, we did not use the word climate change adaptation. So it's something that came across, was reported later by the development partners. It's also clear that these projects that are partially devolved also score relatively low on those principles we talked about, mentioned previously, for locally led adaptation, like the degree of devolution, flexibility, etc. Now, what this analysis was a very initial piece of analysis we did in order to guide our further research. What we concluded was that first of all, we were surprised by the fact of this relative high degree of apparent devolution of finance in Kenya. Devolution in Tanzania compared to Kenya. We think it can be explained by the fact that the way climate change adaptation finance is being classified is very generous. We also find that there's a long tradition of development partner projects being categorized in Tanzania budgets as being within the vote of local governments, even though not really controlled by local governments. And that in general there is also that there's, in Kenya in particular, there's been a time lag of how the development partners are designing programs compared to the opportunities that are offered by the institutional arrangements in the country. Now, there are some cases of more substantive devolution and adherence to the locally led adaptation principles that are emerging. In Kenya, there is a particular program called Financing Locally Led Climate Adaptation, which is a fiscal transfer to local government, to the counties, that is completely non-earmarked, that enable them to prioritize their own projects in response to their own analysis of what climate risks they are facing. That program was designed as we were starting the research project. And this week in Nairobi, the president, His Excellency Ruto, offered counties the first check under that program, and that is also co-financed by DANITA, the Danish embassy, and other bilaterals. So there's some models emerging. In Tanzania, there are only some very small pilot projects in the past, funded by the UK, and currently a very small program financed by UNCDF and the European Union. That's part of a global concept for performance-based adaptation finance to local governments, and DANITA have approved funding to UNCDF to pilot that is in a number of countries, but in each country it's a very small amount of money. So finally, in the field phase, we've started to explore some of these issues that emerge from this mapping. Some of the research is looking at what is driving the donor policies in these two countries, what explains why donors are designing and implementing adaptation projects in this particular fashion. We're also looking at the national strategies and institutional arrangements for enhancing locally led adaptation. And finally, we are looking at, we're starting to look at what are the local experiences with these different adaptation projects that we have analyzed. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Per. I'll now hand the word. We're actually keeping the time, which I'm very happy for. Now we'll follow 4 case studies from our bright PhD students, and the first will be on effective climate finance coordination, stakeholder perception, and political economy in Kenya. I will provide the word to Millicent Omara.
Thank you, Esban. Good morning. My presentation is based on a study from which I have developed a journal article. And my title is Effective Climate Finance Coordination. Then I look at the stakeholder perceptions and political economy of climate policy implementation in Kenya. I place a question mark after effective coordination because there is still more to be done in terms of responding to this question of effective climate finance coordination. So I'll get into what informed this study. And it was based on the fact that even though climate change governance processes are largely political, the debate and studies around climate finance coordination have largely assumed a linear apolitical approach. And so there have been calls to acknowledge climate finance coordination as a political process without really going deeper into examining the extent at which political factors affect climate finance coordination. And there have also been calls, especially in the global south, on the need to have effective climate finance coordination mechanisms, but they do not really clarify how an effective climate finance coordination mechanism should look like. And so the aim of this study was first to examine stakeholder perceptions of effective climate finance coordination mechanism in the context of Kenya, and also to examine the political complexities around climate policy implementation and climate finance coordination. And so for a bit of a background on the policy, the legal framework that we have that guides climate finance coordination in Kenya, we have the Climate Change Act of 2016 that establishes various institutions that guide coordination. And these include the Climate Change Council and the Climate Change Fund. And these institutions are both at the national and subnational levels. The Act also guides devolution of climate finance at the county level, and also how the counties should mainstream the national climate change action plans. It guides legislation at the county level and reporting mechanisms from the subnational to national levels. Besides the Act, we also have a climate finance policy that establishes tracking mechanisms to track climate finance flows in the country. But besides the formal structures, we also have informal coordination mechanisms that have been established, especially by non-government actors to coordinate with the government actors. So in the end, what we have is a seemingly comprehensive coordination mechanism. I will not go into the details of all that in the structure, but just to highlight that blue, where the blue parts represents mainly the government structures, and the red is where we have the coordination structures and the mechanisms. It also shows the sources of funds and the flows of funds. But even with that comprehensive mechanism that we have, when I talked to stakeholders what they think of the existing coordination mechanisms, there are varied responses which are really diverse depending on where the respondents are coming from. And you see that mostly the government respondents agree that we have a coordination mechanism that is working, and that what we have is the best we can have. Even if you look at the finances coming in, it points to donor confidence with the mechanism that we have. But you see, the respondents from civil society organizations are really asking, do we really have a coordination mechanism, even with that? But when you look a little bit back into the history of the climate policy formulation process in Kenya, it was mainly driven by the civil society organizations who really pushed for the enactment of the Act and the policy, and also placing coordination mechanisms under the National Climate Change Council to be domiciled at the presidency. And because these institutions have not been operationalized yet, for the civil society organizations, it could mean that there is no coordination mechanism. But the question of whether politics affect climate policy implementation and coordination mechanism, there is consensus on the responses that I received cutting across government and non-government actors, that indeed politics is a factor in policy implementation. And some saying that with climate finance coordination, actually the political is more important than the technical because it's all about money. And that in coordination, you have to constantly look at the political implications of your technical vibrancy, among other quotes. And so I built on this consensus on the political complexities around climate policy implementation to delve deeper into the climate change, the political economy of climate policy implementation in Kenya, to just understand the extent at which these political factors affect the whole process. And I have based my analysis on the climate change policy implementation process because it informs climate finance coordination to a large extent. And so the article gives more detail on different interests, ideologies, and issues of power. But in the interest of time, I will highlight just a few examples of the ideological differences, especially between the civil society organizations and the government actors that I talked to. So, for example, the establishment of the National Climate Change Council that is supposed to provide overall coordination of climate finance, there is contention on who should chair that council. The Climate Change Act 2016 places it at the presidency and makes the president the chair of that council. But now, while civil society organizations maintain that it should be established the way it is stipulated in the Act, we have government counterparts who now think that that position needs to be lowered a bit to the level of a cabinet minister because it needs to be chaired, the council needs to be chaired by someone who is accountable to a higher authority. And they also argue that the president cannot chair that council, which will be like a mini cabinet because it will constitute it will have 3 cabinet ministers sitting in, and that when resolutions are passed at the council but they need to be placed before the cabinet, it will be difficult for the cabinet to alter what the president already approved at the council. And in terms of establishing the National Climate Change Fund, government, especially the National Treasury, is of the view that the fund should be established under the Public Finance Management Act and not the Climate Change Act. And then if it's established under the PFMA, it means that it's administered by the National Treasury, while the civil society organizations still hold on to the fact that it should be established under the Act and administered by the National Council. And they argue that all of these reasons that the government counterparts are giving are only but excuses to delay the establishment of those institutions for fear of losing some of their power to the council and being subjected to the accountability that the council and the fund would bring. In terms of power relations, I look at power, how power has played at the national level, especially when the civil society organizations who are pushing for the formulation of the act, they largely exercised power with other actors to achieve that outcome, which they have seemingly handed over to government because now there's a narrative of lack of political will from the government to operationalize those institutions and ensure that the coordination mechanisms are in place. And the National Treasury, while pushing for those amendments to have the fund established under PFMA, for them also, if they go through with that proposal or the amendments that they have they have put forward, it means that the fund administration goes under the National Treasury, and that reinforces their power, the financial power that they already have. And so while the civil society organizations were united at the policy formulation process stage, now they are also split over representation in the National Council. And so they lack the consolidated voice that they had at the time of formulation, and so they are not really able to push for the establishment of those institutions as they are stipulated in the Act. Power inequalities are also observed at the county level, where the governor and the members of the members of the county assembly still have high decision-making power, and now they have added power that comes with the allocation of climate finance that has been devolved to the county level. There is politicization in the process of establishment of the climate change committees, which seems to reward the political loyalties. And when you look at it from the power relations standpoint, if these people who have now been proposed to sit in the committees or who are already sitting in the committees were able to influence voting patterns at that time, it means they already had some form of influence and power among their constituents, and now they have this added power to approve or disapprove proposals, which means it has reinforced their power as well. And so overall, climate finance is more likely to reinforce existing power asymmetries as opposed to causing the power shifts that are needed to reduce those inequalities if we go by the way that we are going right now, because actors continue to exercise power over others. But despite this seemingly constrained state of policy implementation, stakeholders still have a view of what they will consider as an effective climate finance coordination mechanism in Kenya. And so I asked, and based on their responses, I came up with this diagram of what they suggested that how an effective climate finance coordination mechanism will look like. And this one too, I will not go into the details, but just to highlight that there is general consensus over the technical components of what will be perceived as an effective climate finance coordination mechanism in the context of Kenya. And those technical bits are represented in the clear boxes. But then we still have contentious issues where stakeholders could not really agree, and those are what I have presented in the gray boxes. And when you look at them, they revolve around issues of politics, power, interests, and different ideologies. And so in the discussion section, I still reiterate the fact that political factors really have a significant impact on the climate change policy implementation and coordination as well. While Kenya presents a seemingly comprehensive policy and institutional framework to guide coordination, it is still hampered by the political barriers. And so it's a call for policy implementers to recognize more the political complexities, because they are really difficult to reconcile, and especially with money at the center. And so there is need to employ strategies that acknowledge these processes for the nonlinear, complex, and political processes that they are. Thank you very much.
Millicent, that was excellent. We're still keeping time. That was the first of the 4 case studies. So we'll move to the next case study on which relates to power by Beatrice Sumari from Tanzania, which will look at the power relationship between the central and local government and the intergovernmental power relations, implication for climate change adaptation finance at the local level in Tanzania, up in Arusha. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Esben. Good morning, everyone. My name is Beatrice Sumari. I'm a PhD student from the University of Dar es Salaam. My co-researchers, who are also my supervisors, are here. Dr. Noah Makula from the University of Dar es Salaam and Esben Fries Hanson. Our research centers around analysis of Tanzanian central-local intergovernmental power relations and how this implicates to climate change adaptation financing at the local level, where the power in Tanzania stays at the central level, and when you go to the local government, there is no power. So we are going to analyze how these two, local and central government, power and powerless, how does it impact climate change adaptation financing at the local level. But before I continue, I would like to ask you a question. Maybe you would like to answer later, or maybe it's a food for thought. Compared to centralized or localized, which approach holds the key to effective local climate change adaptation financing? I'm asking this because there are different arguments. Some researchers and some climate activists argue that some prefer a centralized climate change adaptation financing because they argue that it results to a blueprint technical plans, and also because it consists of only one decision maker, which is a central government. But others also go to the opposite side by arguing that central climate change adaptation financing should be locally financed, because this is when it reflects to the local needs, it brings sustainability, and it is also cost effectiveness. But also, according to Adaptation Fund 2020, there is an evidence, it came with the evidence that when climate change adaptation financing is locally led, it is more cost effective. But despite this evidence, so far, the voices and the experience of the local level have been less audible in the national and international climate discourse. And according to Khan et al., he said that climate change adaptation finance is about power, politics, and in Tanzania, the balance of power stays at the central government. And in Tanzania, as my other co-researchers already started saying, climate change adaptation activities are centrally funded. And this has related to limited funding to climate change adaptation activities at the local level. And it has also limited the government to plan for its own adaptation activities, because we assume that the local government should be responsible to plan for adaptation activities. But when they wait for everything to be coming from the central level, then there's always limited funding at the local level, so the country fails to plan for adaptation activities. Our study was purely qualitative. We did semi-structures to this list here: central government officials, local government, key informants, implementing partner, the councillors, project beneficiaries, but also we did some non-participatory observation in our field trips. I will not go into details because of time, but I'll be happy to answer your questions if you want to know how we came up with this list. Now, let's see what the research findings are saying. First of all, the research shows that the Tanzania central government and the local relations is a complicated relationship. Why complicated? Because in 1998, Tanzania government established the local government reform program along with decentralization by devolution policy with the aim of establishing local government as self-governing institutions which are free to make policy and operational decisions in line with national guidelines and the laws. And this policy had it meant to downsize the central government, reform local government, and transfer more power to them. But the findings show that despite having this policy in place, it is not practiced. So in the policy, the local government are declared autonomous, but when you come to practice, they are not autonomous. And here there were kind of different responses from key informants who were arguing that the policy was not implemented because the central government did not have resources to implement it. But when you came to the local government officers, were arguing that it's just the lack of political will of the central government to devolve power to them. So due to this, despite the fact that the local government is supposed to implement climate change adaptation activities, the central government plays a dominant role in Tanzania. Now let's see how central government plays its power by controlling local government authorities through structure. In Tanzania, the findings show that the central government is using its position to influence practices such as an equal distribution of resources for the purpose of maintaining control. They are doing this by devolving power, but not funds. When you have power and you don't have resources, you can't implement any projects. Theoretically, power itself is not a resource. And when the central government devolves funds to the local government, it is always tagged with guidelines strictly to implement the central government prioritized projects at the local level. And I have a quote here from one of my key informants who said that the central government is doing this because it is an elitist mindset that you cannot trust a villager or someone who has not gone to school to make any decision. Another findings shows that the local government of Tanzania have teeth, but they cannot bite. Why? Because they don't have resources. Another reason is because they cannot approve their own rules and regulations. They can make rules and regulations, but they cannot approve them. They have to be sent to the central government to be approved, and the central government is where resources accumulate. But also the local government in Tanzania does not have control over their own initiated sources of revenue collection. For example, the local government established a revenue source of collection that was parking fees, but when it started to take over, it was centralized. But also they don't have authority to borrow money from financial institutions unless they get approval from the central government. Now this Dikovic and Wundt says without autonomy to make their own decisions, local government becomes mere extensions of local central government bureaucracies. But also some local government respondents said this kind of relationship creates dependency. And he said it's like local government is like those kids who they have grown up there, but their parents cannot allow to do anything on their own. Now let's look at the challenges of local government authorities in Tanzania. Before I go to the challenges, I should read this quote from the central government official who said, "We help local government because if the donor says, for example, write a theory of change for the project, we must do it because local government does not know what the theory of change is." This was the response from the central government official. But also these responses of only about capacity did not only come from the key informant or government officials, but also our field visit, we experienced capacity challenges at the local level. But also another thing which came out is that the local government officials are lacking exposure of dealing with climate change activities, because these climate change activities in Tanzania mainly happens at the central level. The central government officials have more exposure because they deal with developing policies and they undergo different capacity building processes, which rarely trickles down to the local level. And when you look at the literature, we see that sometimes, about this lack of exposure, I'll give an example. We visited one office in Arusha, and we were mainly, the researchers had in several occasions had to answer the question, what is climate change? Because the local government officials did not know what is climate change. Especially in one climate change adaptation project, the employees of that project did not know that they are working in the climate change adaptation project. But some stakeholders have also come to address this challenge of capacity building at the local level, but they also face some challenges. For example, the frequent reshuffles and the reassignment of new positions. For example, one stakeholder said sometimes the participant at the continuation of a capacity building session. This lack of consistency discourages capacity building efforts. Now let's look at councillors' decision-making power. In every district official, local government officials in Tanzania, there are councillors. These are local politicians at the ward level. And according to the Tanzanian policies and guidelines, a local government, a councillor can be anyone who has a basic literacy skill. But according to the finding now, it shows that these councillors, most of them are non-educated, and they have significant decision-making power over local government officials who are experts. For example, I'll read this quote to you. It says, councillors are more powerful than local government officials. Majority of them are non-educated, but they guide local government officials. If the local government officials do not align with their councillors, they are threatened and they might lose their jobs. Now, what are the councillors' perspective and the motivations behind their actions? The researchers had the opportunity to talk to some councillors, and when they were asked their responsibility, although all of them acknowledge that their areas are affected by climate change, such as flooding and prolonged drought, but most of them say that their job is to encourage their people to plant trees so that they can adapt to climate change. But they also explain the community challenges, such as limited awareness. The community in local government, they associate climate change with witchcraft, and some of them also with God's will. So the councillors will say that they cannot use climate change as a driving agenda to convince people to vote them, because it's something which God's will, and community associate them with witchcraft. But also you can see this quote, the last quote here from a respondent in the group discussion, who said, our village is still underdeveloped. We need roads and schools, so as we can't vote for someone talking about climate change. This is showing how capacity, limited awareness in the local communities are. Now, in conclusion, we can say that apart from the top-down system of financing of climate change adaptation activities being a barrier to building resilient communities, the system is stimulated by the existing situations at the local level, which with lack of capacity and limited awareness, and also local politics. Existence of these structures imposed by the current centralized system, which gives significant decision-making power to councillors, constrains also the local government officials' capacity development, because then the position where they are waiting for guidelines to be made at the central level, when they receive funds, they don't have decision-making power over them, so they can't really exercise their capacity and the expertise. Also, our findings recommend a governance structure with clear definitions of the roles of the local councillors and other climate change actors. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. Let's have a 15 minutes break for a cup of coffee, and then we will continue the last 3 interventions and a question and answer session. Okay, welcome back from coffee break. We will move on to Peter Rogers, who will talk about central-led adaptation finance in Tanzania. I'll leave the word to you.
Thank you very much, Esben. My name is Peter Rogers. I come from University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and I'm presenting to you on the central government-led adaptive finance in Tanzania. This work is just complementing from the previous studies, especially that from Hans-Peter, Pia, and Beatrice. Then the basis of this study it comes from the some sort of introductions that says that financing climate change remains among the principal components for the world climate discussions, and this is toward adaptation. And the recent target for Paris Agreement, those 100 billion per year, has appeared to be like ambitious, like it's not yet reached. The target is not yet reached, and from that finance, the amount that goes to climate change adaptation again is very low. Now, despite of those views, the big volume of global climate change adaptation financing, and actually it's a proportion that's sent to the developing countries, again, is very low, and most of the finance, as Hans-Peter has said, is loan, and most of the developing countries, they are hardly to get those loans. And then comes to Beatrice's perspective, like it's a political kind of money. Then again, the abilities of the developing countries to give some money from their own collection into climate change adaptation again is very low. And this study then tries to track the public finance from both international and national sources from 2014 to 2022, which builds on the study which is actually was published here this year. The working report that has been published here, I think, this year. Then this study analyzed the Tanzanian national budget from 2014 to 2022, and this the study looked projects like the allocation of money in the national budget, which were climate-related kind of projects. Then there were some steps, but now the key findings shows that the national budget allocated about 1.7 billion for adaptation from 2014 to 2022. But 1.2 billion was from international sources, and half of the billion was from the national collections. This still reflected to what Hans-Peter said, and it is that the ability of the country to finance climate change adaptation is still low. And one of the reasons, as we can see, is saying this 1.7 billion in the national budget and the 1.2 billion from the international sources, it shows some a bit of lift up, like it has increased, but this is because of the increased allocations from the bilateral and the multilateral institutions as part of their obligations in the Paris Agreement. But again, the 29% of the national collections is a bit low compared to the international funding, and this is because there are competing priorities in the country. As Pia said, that the local governments in the country pays for the schools and all that, so it means at the local level they're a bit burdened, and most of the finances that are collected locally goes in that side, and now climate change adaptation looks like to have less priorities. Yes, plus the reasons that Beatrice has said, like there are a lot of things, lack of awareness and all that. And again, this study again analyzed like where large amount of this finance is managed. This study found that large part of this finance, around 87%, is managed at the ministerial level, and 0.6 at the regions, and just 12% is at the local communities, at the local government authorities, and again this reflects what Beatrice has said, that the local governments seems to they don't have capacity to manage this large amount of money. Rather, it's preferred to be kept at the ministerial level. But this 87% comes to the communities, but they are managed at the ministries. Yes. Yes. Now this now at least gives the governments that now is a time to increase some amount into climate change adaptation, and at least do the necessity kind of things, like to increase that amount at the local level and all that, so that adaptation can be actually done as it's supposed to be done. Yes, thanks.
Thank you very much, Rogers. So now we'll go to the final of the case studies by Judith Mulva. From exclusion to inclusion, emerging subnational climate adaptation finance vehicles in Kenya. And go to a bit more uplifting case of devolved mechanisms for climate change adaptation. Judith?
Yes,
Welcome.
thank you, Aspan. I'm looking at the decentralized climate finance, but looking at emerging subnational climate adaptation financing vehicles in Kenya. Ideally, we're talking about coordination but it's also equally important to know how this money is packaged, because of course you're not going to withdraw the money from a bank, from an ATM. It comes in a particular way, in a particular form. And unfortunately, the forms of it are influenced by things that are way beyond us. But by the time you're going to a particular country, as there would be emerging, it is very important for you to understand what are some of these macro but also micro factors that would enable this subnational climate financing vehicles to succeed or to work, or even to effectively then give that money to the community. Rightly said by most of my predecessors, they talked about a lot about that financing is actually quite important in addressing some of the climate vulnerabilities, both national and subnational. But the history of it starts in COP15, and the outcomes, of course, were to collectively mobilize 100 billion by 2020 to support countries in the global south. And then in COP16, they came up with financing vehicles, which are commonly known as the big boys. Not sure why not big girls, but the big boys who are GEF, GCF, and the Adaptation Fund. However, we're pursuing equal representation as far as adaptation and mitigation in the global south. But then this direct access modality that these instruments came up with are actually challenged by institutional weaknesses, because you have to adhere to, environmental, social requirements, and even fiduciary requirements by the time you're applying to these big boys, as outlined by the World Bank. And this has inadvertently, like not by good, not intentionally, encouraged the emergence of innovative finance models. Because of course we need the money, but we can't access the money. It's way up there. And of course we need the money. And so rightly said by Millicent at some point, where coordination was majorly, done by NGOs or at NGO level. The same thing in terms of climate financing model, they were quite micro, where you'd find, we're getting, for example, an NGO that is actually implementing this in the global south and specifically in Kenya. So the other consortium here did a decade of testing and failing in the different counties for it to actually approve that, this climate finance adaptation model can actually work. And so sometime in 2019, we saw, or very recently, as Per said, the government then decided to adopt the other consortium as the micro climate finance to a Kenyan level or a macro level where it covers the different counties. And of course, to look at their climate vulnerabilities, but also to address. And that's how the GFLOCA model that we have been talking about came about. So in this regard, I am investigating then adaptation to climate change financing at subnational level using the decentralized governance lens, where you're looking at the three facets, which is the political, administrative, and fiscal facets, but then also appreciating that devolution plays a very key role when you're operationalizing such climate finance models. And this is because, of course, as you would know, the Kenya's devolution, then it shifted power or aimed to shift the power and resources from the central to the local governments. And these local governments, as you would see or might have heard, is they're quite autonomous. They can make decisions apart from the sector that Per mentioned earlier on, which is education. So climate change in Kenya is actually a devolved function. So I will jump into the results. Which is one, we're looking at it from a political decentralization. And what does it really mean from a devolved climate finance model? It would be, of course, the fact why it would work or in anticipation of it working is because there are 47 county governments. And these 47 county governments represent 47 climate vulnerabilities. So this means that you're actually addressing climate vulnerabilities not as one big envelope, but depending on the different geographies and jurisdictions. And this is quite important because, of course, the jurisdictions in, let's say, Nairobi would be very different from the jurisdictions in Mombasa. The climate vulnerabilities in Makueni, which is an ASAL region, will be very different from the climate vulnerabilities and priorities in Nakuru, which is quite cold and nice and very fancy. So again, you can't say climate adaptation from a big envelope context called Kenya. It is quite challenging. And so political decentralization then kind of enables that for these counties to look at climate vulnerabilities at that angle. But then even with the climate vulnerabilities, these political jurisdictions, the 47, have their own, mandates and priorities, which is under the CIDPs. We call them the County Integrated Development Plans. And so they dictate and say, okay, your vulnerabilities are 50, or, how do we prioritize and say out of the 50, these 2 are actually quite important and could probably integrate the others. So the CIDPs then inform that. And it is based on a legislation, of course, in Kenya that enables it. Looking at the administrative, I would look at it in 2 ways. Administratively, in terms of the emergence of institutions and structures, but also institutions that are coming to complement or to give that money. So institutions, which is one, we're looking at, I don't know if you can see this, but that's an example of an institution that the financing in FLOCA is trying to develop. So where you have the ward climate change planning committees, then you have the county climate change planning committees that are giving money to the public good investment in the wards and the counties, and the wards being the lowest jurisdiction within a county and such. This is important, of course, as we said. The reason why you're looking at vulnerabilities is because you're trying to make sure that the interests of the people are taken on board. This is quite different if you're looking at it from a national perspective. So these institutions are emerging now in all the 47 counties, which is actually pretty interesting. But then FLOCA is also trying to build institutional capacity. And later on, when you're looking at the fiscal decentralization, you'll see why or how this money then has been, refocused to majorly build the institutional capacity. Because we know anyway, in finance, one of the issues that we grapple with is, do you really have the capacity to, make sure that the money is flowing? It's one thing having money in your bank. It's another issue, using the money and in the right and intended way, which a lot of it then goes to the institutional capacity. And then, of course, we're looking at it also from the World Bank perspective, where, of course, they have different instruments. So we have the World Bank Investment Project Financing Instrument, which provides debt financing, and it is what that gives money to FLOCA. But then we also have the P4R, which is the Program for Results Financing Modality, which provides the grants. So just to mention that when you're looking at the World Bank and how that money comes into the country, which I will speak about in the fiscal decentralization, it comes in 2 ways. The 2 different financial instruments, which is the debt and the grant. So the debt is managed by the national, while the grant is managed by the counties. And the reason, of course, for both is institutional capacities at both levels. But then, of course, there are surrounding issues around that, as rightly said by Hans, that Kenya is moving from a low-income country to a middle-income country, meaning that, of course, what does it really mean? That all development partners they give us more of debt and less of grants. So, of course, it's some sort of transition. Now, where the meat is, I would say, where I stand, the fiscal decentralization. So the paper or the article is looking at the fiscal decentralization in expenditure mandates, like what gives you the mandate to use that money or to disburse that money or for the money to flow in a particular way, what revenues, intergovernmental transfers, and borrowing. And this is important, of course, when you're looking at fiscal decentralization because it gives you a sound financial management and expenditure control, but then you have to comply with existing national financial management laws, which is as highlighted. And in that regard, I would just give a quick overview of what this means. It means, one, it is one thing to prioritize, but it's another thing to ensure that the money is set aside. So with fiscal decentralization, you're also looking at allocations. And the Kenya Finance Management Law of 2012 actually expects the counties to allocate 30% of the financing to climate change. But this is an issue that Kenya is grappling with over time. And I have some data, of course, in the paper that would discuss like how has it been since 2015 to now, you know, and that level of variation. And you would see that at some point it was low and then it picked up. Yeah, maybe because of course now FLOCA is here, so people have to comply, whether you like it or not, because you want the money. Number two, these enabling environments and guidelines support local governments as fiduciary institutions to the climate change adaptation, but do not have sufficient resources. We say that there are 47 counties and they are autonomous, but they don't have the money, you know. So this is a problem. And we can see that initially we call it the Public Finance Act of 2012. It actually empowered the cabinet secretary, and I liked when Millicent talked about the cabinet secretary. He was actually empowered financially, though, not on a coordination perspective, but financially, to guarantee loans to the county governments. But since inception of devolution, no county has dared to go to the cabinet secretary and requested for a loan. And this is, of course, there are complications around that, because, of course, you need a guarantee. The national government needs to guarantee you. And so what has been happening and the model that has been existing, which then supports or, you know, is backing FLOCA, is the national government then gets a loan and then it trickles down to the counties. So there could be two financial ways of getting this money, but they chose one to the other, which is that. But then we see that there are challenges to that, which is the intergovernmental transfers, you know, in terms of delays. There are delays, and it's because there's a conditional revenue allocation bill that needs to be updated every year. So if it's not updated, then you wait. If it's not updated, then you wait. So some of these challenges are there. And then finally, of course, county government are also mandated to develop complementary programs. So it's one thing waiting for the national government to, you know, disburse these funds, but still under FLOCA, they are expected to, you know, match the grant, you know. And they have a grant of 1.25 million a year. And remember, we said that they don't have the money. Question is, where are they going to get this money from? But I'm assuming maybe 30% of the budget and more. That's why we see, you know, there's the need of private sector to come in and things like that to complement some of these activities, but that's a requirement under FLOCA. And finally, of course, as mentioned earlier on, the economic stature. You know, for our model to work, it has to be within an economic stature. If you go to a low-income country, then it's a grant. But if you come to Kenya, where we have graduated a little bit, then it's a loan. And what does that mean? It means that the quantity of grants are reduced, so it will keep transitioning. And then, of course, the development partners provide loans. And rightly said by Pierre, so far we have seen government of Denmark, Sweden, and now KfW from Germany coming to put money into the FLOCA basket to implement this program. Okay, so policy implications, these are just but a few. One, devolution creates a conducive environment for the structures and institutions to be deployed under FLOCA and any other emerging climate finance model, which is quite important. So we're not sure whether how this would work in a central government. It would be interesting to see how that would work in Tanzania. Autonomy is a big question because a lot of, you know, everything I've spoken about is really anchored on the national level. So the counties, of course, they have their own laws and regulations and things like that. But when you're talking about finance, it's very national. You have to adhere to the same. So autonomy is a question, and what level or degree of autonomy. And finally, of course, the new structures. We have the privilege of testing and failing for the last 10 years, but just to specific 7 counties. Now it's replicated to the 40. These 7 counties are already like 10 meters or like yards away. These other ones are still catching up. So of course the 40s will also have to test and fail. So hopefully then the financiers also understand that the 40 will have to test and fail for a very long time. And that leeway is actually quite important when you're talking about decentralized climate finance models. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Judith, for an excellent talk. That was the 4 cases, and now we will round up the speech by a talk by Jamal on the wider political economy of devolved governance of climate change adaptation from point of departure in Tanzania, before moving to the question and answer session.
Thank you. A very good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to give a very short presentation, but it's a presentation that ties together some of the micro studies that have already been elucidated here, as well as some of the meso explanations of of the dynamics that underpin decentralization, sometimes also tend to underpin adaptation in both Tanzania and Kenya. And by and large, our work is to try and tie everything together, but then from the perspective of the macro institutions that are actually involved. And herein, we actually have a very interesting subject in that we deal with not just as the fieldwork has actually gone on, we've actually found out that it deals with not just the political economy of simple adaptation, but also the devolution aspect, of which, by and large, as we arrive towards the end, we'll find out that they can be somewhat distinct, but also do share some similarities. And the most beautiful aspect is the intersection of how these political forces that govern adaptation are actually being put out into practice, and vis-a-vis how the forces that actually encourage the current devolution structure in Tanzania also playing out. So essentially, our work is on still very much evolving, in the sense that while we've already done the field work, we are still in the process of finalizing the analysis, and principally our approach is to try and examine the formal rules as well as the informal political bargaining, by taking into consideration the personal, the political, as well as the networks that govern interactions for institutions involved in both adaptation as well as in devolution. And crucially, we're more interested in the interrelationships between the formal and informal institutions based on the extent to which they enable or constrain the decentralization of climate change policy and financing in Tanzania, they concentrate or deconcentrate power, and incorporate as well as exclude civil society concerns. And our framework, so why do we actually consider this to be particularly important? So there are 3 main issues. The first one being the implementation gap. Even though Esben did reach out did mention it at the beginning that there's very little money actually earmarked for adaptation that actually gets to the local level, we've taken this as a point of departure, that actually less than 10% of finance actually ends up reaching local government levels for implementation. Now, therein lies the question: why and how? Given the fact that we are all aware that climate change is actually best implemented all the way at the local level because of so many different reasons, and so many of the internationally best practices have actually been attesting to this. Secondly, we're interested in climate change development research, and crucially, we want to know the political forces that underpin the extent to which climate change affects different livelihoods. And this is also being partially driven by locally led adaptation principles in relation to good governance, patient and predictable funding, as well as issues in relation to capacity building for institutional legacies. So we have a framework for analyzing the devolution of climate change adaptation. And we have decided to split things up into 4 main issues, and therein we've provided through a series of intense literature reviews as well as interviews, we've provided the status quo in as far as how the current status adheres to some of these devolution principles for climate change adaptation. So one, on the issue of subsidiarity and the devolution of decision-making responsibilities, Pierre has already talked about the presence of 184 local government authorities, as well as more than 10,000 lower-level local government authorities, each with their own administration and governments. But peers also talked about the straitjacketing of these particular institutions, in the sense that they do exist in form, but then their functions are actually quite limited and quite prescribed, and so they're merely extension agencies, much like also what Beatrice also talked about a few minutes ago. And the issue of flexibility, we are aware of as a result of the straitjacketing, we're aware of the fact that there's an inherent amount of earmarked funding, as well as conditional financing that tends to limit discretion at the local level. So you do have local government authorities that claim to be implementing projects that have a degree of adaptation concerns, but not necessarily the complete freedom to actually decide on the actual content, or even to decide issues in relation to finance and their relative administration. And thirdly, issues of finance, specifically the patience and the predictability. We through our work, we have established that a lot of adaptation interventions in Tanzania, and to a large extent also in Kenya, are based on the project approach. And the vast majority of these particular projects they actually have no system for allocation of climate financing based on transparent and equitable formulae, but rather being dominated by central design and central implementation, with agents at the local level being as mere vehicles for conveying a narrative that these are actually projects that currently taking place within their vicinity. And then last but not least, in the issue of devolution of finance to subnational level, we are aware that first and foremost, local government authorities, they do receive very little in terms of, they do mobilize very little, and hence have to rely a considerable deal on subventions from the central level. And we are aware that the vast majority of adaptation projects, they tend to be classified as development projects, of which the proportion of development financing at the local level has been coming down considerably. It has gone down from $12 per capita back in 2015 to about $4 per capita back in 2021. So all of these, they do point to a scenario, one, of increased stressed levels of financing, and two, the inherent political ramifications that come about as a result of having a small pot of money, but several different competing priorities and several different competing actors. So the findings that we're getting from the field, they can actually be broadly grouped into three main aspects. One, there's an issue of ambiguity. Two, an issue of limited agency. And three, an issue of power. And how did we go about grouping our findings into these three broad categories? One, there is an issue that for us, adaptation is very much being seen as a political legacy of concrete historical struggles, because when you view it over a long durée, you start realizing that the institutional actors that are currently engaged in adaptation, the essence of their work, the essence of their existence, actually very much draws from whether they're being considered to be important to the governing coalitions or not. In Tanzania, issues in relation to the environment and adaptation, they tend to be concentrated in and around the vice president's office. Now, unfortunately, and I suspect as in most areas, the vice presidents, they're supposed to be seen but not necessarily heard. And as a result, these are offices that tend to be criminally underfunded. They tend to have limited exposure to international partners. They tend to be constrained in terms of the staffing, but all of these are deliberate designs to disempower such officers, to make them subordinates rather than competitors or independent entities that can actually support the presidency or the office of the prime minister. However, and so in the case of Tanzania, with respect to the office of the vice president, this was actually a docket that was seen as being not of much use, and as a result, it was given a set of policy principles or policy areas to concern with which were largely internal and largely areas that did not involve them being in the public spotlight every now and then. So in Tanzania, the VPO's office was given the docket of to concern with issues in relation to the union matters. So this basically meant having a series of meetings throughout the year to talk about some of the right and wrongs of the unions with no concrete performance measures to show for. And also, they're also given the docket of the environment, because in Tanzania, the docket of the environment, issues in relation to the environment were primarily seen as involving tree planting, the preservation of forests, and these are issues of which we did not have much political mileage, they were not expected to attract much financing, and they're not seen as being crucial or important enough to become areas of major political contestation. However, you're all aware of the change in the international development discourse that brought about that brought to the fore issues in relation to climate change. It brought to the fore issues in relation to finance. The Copenhagen Accord and subsequently the Paris Agreement, and all of a sudden, climate change and adaptation, these are big businesses. We're talking about potentially up to $100 billion a year, and to make matters worse, respective countries were invited to prepare their nationally determined contributions. And in the case of Tanzania, adaptation through our nationally determined contribution is supposed to attract close to $9.2 billion between now and 2030. So that roughly works out as something like $1 billion a year, and roughly that's the equivalent to 2% of GDP, and even more importantly, that's roughly about 6% of the national budget a year. So all of a sudden, adaptation has gone from something of which just basically involves a series of meetings and something which is inherently technical to something which is politically in the spotlight and also has the potential to attract a lot of money. Just to put things into perspective, when I say $1 billion a year for adaptation alone, in comparison, that's roughly about the same amount of money that the agriculture sector the whole budget for the agriculture sector is at this moment in time. So naturally, this has changed the dynamics. It has changed the ways in which the VPO office relates to other partners, and it has changed its relative weight politically. So, the adage concern: more money, more problems. So as a result, adaptation has now become fraught with tensions, because obviously, if the VPO opens up, it will mean that they'll be giving away slices of their cake. And then there will be resource considerations, and there will be other distribution consequences. And this is what is creating the ambiguity. And this is being deliberately perpetuated by the nationally determined authority, or by the nationally designated authority, which is the VPO, to ensure that it tends to preserve its territory. It tends to hold on to its territory as the principal actor when it comes to adaptation. And crucially, this is, as a result of the ambiguity, this is contributing to the lack of agency in as far as the money people are concerned, principally the Treasury, in that as the Treasury cannot understand what adaptation actually means, it means that it has allocated far fewer resources, and it's less of a priority for them. They see it as being merely a donor and project-funded entity. So, this is something that is best dealt with by VPO. So there's a bit of a case of passing the buck where it fits, and as a result, there's not much money flowing, and we have a limited agency. This gives rise to a limited agency because even though on paper the VPO's office was not supposed to be politically important, but it does actually matter, because as events over the last 24 months have actually shown, all of a sudden a vice president can also end up ascending to the presidency. So all of a sudden there's now a tug of war between the respective key veto players. So we're talking about the Minister of Finance, the Vice President's office, And in this particular instance, PRAG. PRAG is the ministry responsible for local authorities, so they are the ones responsible for the devolution. Now, they belong in the president's office, so they are a key player when it comes to the implementation side, but they're not the ones who are directly responsible for the policy aspects of adaptation. Nor are they the ones who have been officially designated as the nationally designated authority, nor are they the ones who are key to unlocking the financing from the Ministry of Finance. So we do have a tug of war involving the three main players with no specified delegated authority for accountability, and that's also contributing to the stasis that currently permeates. And then there's an issue of power. There's an issue of power because there are three of the most powerful ministries in Tanzania. So as a result of the flexing, no one wants really to yield power to the other one. VPO, they're concerned if they allow other actors into the adaptation process, they'll end up becoming even more irrelevant. In the case of the Ministry of Finance, for them, adaptation is not so much of a concern, but they're also acutely aware of the potential that it can have when it comes to attracting foreign flows of money. And at a time when there's an acute shortage of foreign currency, this has become an issue. And in the case of the ministry responsible for local authorities, they're just there. They're just stuck in the middle. They want to get on with business, but also at the same time, they are incapable of stepping onto the toes of the MOF or the VPO for very obvious reasons. So, as a result, historically, we've had challenges when it comes to institutionalizing the budget process, to cater or to create the structures necessary for the flow of adaptation financing. And this has given rise to challenges when it comes to the broader governance of adaptation. And as a result, it's just a preservation of the status quo and a continued interplay between the different political forces that are actively trying to contest, shape, and carve out niches for their own respective existences. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamal. This is what we had to say. Now the word is yours. Eric, could you come up? Eric, Kyoko will be facilitating the question and answer session.
Thank you very much, Espen.
And David, you have a microphone for people to speak in? Okay. Okay, the word is open.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Esben. Before I open the floor for questions, it seems there is a seeming mood that perhaps climate adaptation financing could be causing more problems than creating the solutions that are intended. I think the problems already started with Hans-Peter about the numbers and what the numbers show, particularly with only 33% of public finance being earmarked for adaptation, which is, of course, as we have seen, not really enough. Again, the problems continue with Pear's paper on the quality of adaptation finance beyond the numbers, and you could clearly see there's limited focus on adaptation and the whole debate about the locally led adaptation. Millicent's paper mainly talks about the politics of power, mentions that politics and power affect coordination of climate adaptation financing. Beatrice's paper, again, devolving power but not resources. Rogers, again, pointing to the fact that only $1.7 billion go to adaptation. Jamal clarifies that that is only a small budget that perhaps cannot even be enough for the agricultural sector alone. Judith showing us these innovative models that are emerging towards climate adaptation financing, and also, again, making the case that these locally led models are essentially also top-down to a large extent. And then, again, Jamal bringing the discussion to a close with these formal, informal decision-making processes and the complexities around that. Just to mention a few silences that I see here, there's a level of entrenching of democracy that goes together with climate adaptation financing. So these are interests for some people. Loans and grants, where loans again become more or less like debt to some people. So do we talk about debt and adaptation at the same time? How can somebody who is under debt be adapting or something like that? What is the outcome of adaptation, if any? We do not see that as of now. And then there's also some neoliberal tendency of development that is also emerging out of the entire discussion. If you look at it from a thin eye or from a closer eye. And then for some in the global south, adaptation, climate adaptation financing becomes more or less like another donor aid that everybody should go for, and whether to pay or not is something that is left for discussion. Anyway, I was just making a little bit of noise before I open the floor for questions. I hope you've been taking notes. We were meant to have participants online. I do not know whether we have any participants online. All right, good. So, shoot. Should we have the guys come here, the presenters? At least they are here. Yes, the first question, we can have a round of questions, the first round, and then they respond. Yeah, please do. Please come. We have tables here with pens for the speakers. Just come to the front. The questions can be addressed directly to the speaker or to the group. Hans-Peter, please. It is also good that you mention your name and the organization you come from, and then shoot your question. All right. You'll assist with the microphone. Please.
Okay. Thanks very much. Andrew Wardell from the Center for International Forestry Research. Many thanks to DIIS for organizing this seminar, and particular thanks to the very interesting and promising 4 PhD candidates in their presentations. But I have a question which fits within the comment you made about silences, Jakob, to particularly Hans-Peter, Per, and probably Espen, since he also referred to figures in his opening remarks. And that relates to the silence on another study which was published less than a month ago on finance flows, which has highlighted that the total annual financing from the world's leading banks amounted to $513 billion a year to the global south to fund fossil fuel investments and industrial scale agriculture. Roughly 450 billion for fossil fuels and over almost 60 billion for industrial agriculture. These two sectors are actually fueling the climate crisis. So I wanted to ask the question, do you not think that until and unless we address these two big elephants in the room, we are likely to see any significant change in the quantity of financing to support climate change adaptation? Thank you.
Excellent. We had 2 questions over here before we shift to the other side. You and the gentleman at the back. All right then. Yeah, please.
I had a question I think is for across here. My name is René Karatki. I'm working on a small company called Sustainable Development Partners. My question is related to private sector finance and the possibilities and the challenges for private sector finance in adaptation, which I know I'm coming mainly from the energy perspective and supply of energy services. There are some activities going on how to mobilize private sector for decentralized energy provision. I just wonder, what is the discussion? What do you have how do you see the challenges around this particular issue when it comes to private adaptation?
Sector? Yeah. Judith, that would be towards you. More questions for that round? Yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Anna. I work for Forests of the World, and I work with East Africa portfolio. And my question is regarding that a lot of you have focal point on local governments and the need for local structures and everything. But there's also a gap in the way we analyze climate in local perspective, and I think there is a gap in climate analysis. So just maybe want your perspective on how we should integrate more like weather reports and climate analysis in climate adaptation.
Thank you, Anne. Please, sir.
Thank you. My name is Rolf Hörnow. I'm an independent consultant. I think my question is for Per and Beatrice, if I remember correctly, and I might have gotten the details wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong. But I think one of you said a surprisingly high percentage of Tanzanian climate finance for adaptation was actually devolved, up to 50% or close to that number. Whereas the other one told us that this whole sort of problem of devolved power but no funding with the LGAs in Tanzania. So without being an expert on any of this, I'm just asking, how does this reconcile? Because if there is a lot of funding with LGAs through project funding, and there's a preference, we were told, I think, from certain development partners to fund the LGAs over central government, they do have funding, don't they?
Yeah, thank you very much. Shall we get the responses and then we come for round 2? Okay, good. So we start with Hans-Peter. Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. You had this figure about, is it a CPI study? But there's a... exactly, okay, it's good. Exactly, yes. And I think ActionAid, and I'd also like to highlight MS in Denmark, MS ActionAid in Denmark. They're very active on fighting the fossil investments, the Danske Bank and many things, and these studies from. So I think ActionAid is playing a very important role in international NGOs. I remember another figure is about the investment in fossil is still this year about 5 times more than renewable energies, 5 times more. So I mean, there's another figure in this direction. Last COP27 in Egypt, all the NGOs, there's very well organized NGO community called Climate Action Network. It has 1,700 NGOs as affiliated. They work so well together. And I mean, among them are Greenpeace, WWF, Oxfam, the Church, and also Southern Development NGOs. So I think last year the big fight was the Loss and Damage Fund. And that was a bit surprised it was possible to achieve the decision on loss and damage in Egypt. Now this year I see on the mailing list for these can that the big issue is to fight the fossil investments and the industrial agriculture, as you refer. But the fossil is the biggest thing for the international NGOs for the next COP28. So I think I would like to say that Dan Jørgensen is doing a very, very good work internationally. It's not much covered in Denmark, but in the COP26 in Glasgow, it was Dan and it was a environmental minister for South Africa. They were a bit for the NDC, the reduction targets, they fighted that. And they got a text last Saturday, all the day Saturday was negotiated if there could be a text saying reducing or phasing out coal, oil and gas. And then there was a bit rephrased to phasing down and not phasing out. There was a debate all the Saturday, and for first time ever there was a decision in COP26 about reducing oil and gas exploration. That was really important. And this year, Dan Jørgensen and this Southern Africa female environmental minister have been given their role by the COP28 presidency to continue. They're already working hard on consultations now. So I think this about reduction, agreement about reducing is a very important point for COP28.
Thank you very much. The next question was from René, I think towards Judith, mobilizing private sector finance. Where do we stand?
I will try answer your question. Private sector is like the angle on private sector in adaptation is quite unique, and I think it's a discussion that is actually being taken very seriously. And this is because, of course, private sector looks at two things, which is profit and increasing their market share, but also their value chains. So if you don't touch on those three, you're really out of their discussion. But of course, part of the things that, you know, I think developing countries are looking into now is creating the right incentives for the private sector to actually invest in the sector. And the incentives, there's a policy brief that I just did. I think it's published. It's in a carton out there. But you're looking at it as from a price perspective where, you know, how much money are they getting? Regulatory perspective where you're looking at, you know, if we do invest in adaptation, which is considered risky by private sector, would we get any tax, you know, rebates, or, you know, will you look at our tax and say, okay, well, you actually looked at adaptation and let's try and waive a little bit of your tax and things like that. From a property perspective then, and copyright, and say, oh, okay, you're working with adaptation, okay, so copyrights on this and that, and especially when you're looking at innovations. So there's that macro level in terms of incentives. But there's a very interesting discussion caveat that I think it's developing over time, and this is the carbon markets. Because a lot of these private sectors are very keen on, you know, making sure that the operations adhere to particular standards that, you know, they don't emit, rightly said. You know, if you're looking at agriculture and you can't really phase them out, you phase them down, which gives an opportunity, of course, for carbon markets, which is mitigation, of course. But there's a new angle that's coming where you're looking at core benefits. And core benefits is ideally adaptation, because you're looking at gender, you're looking at health, you're looking at agriculture. So you're using mitigation ideally to finance adaptation. And I think that's where the conversation now is going. And you can see that even with the Africa Climate Summit, the carbon tax is being discussed from an Africa perspective, because we have the carbon sinks. You know, majority of the carbon sinks are in Africa. So what does that mean for us? However much, you know, there's the mitigation aspect. So core benefits are coming up as an adaptation mechanism, financing adaptation. It's going to take time. The structures and regulations need to be put in place. The pricing needs to be right. So that's another angle that's really coming up on adaptation and private sector. But it's an objective in my PhD, so maybe look me up in another 1 year. I might have more answers, but these are just preliminary findings.
Thank you very much. The next question, I think, which was general to whoever has an answer, was from Anna, and she asks, she sees a very huge gap, particularly in the way we analyze climate change at the local level. Yes, Per, please.
Yeah, and you were, the way I understood your question was whether, I mean, the extent of more technical understanding of climate change adaptation challenges by location, etc., etc. And of course, at the national level, most of the countries have developed these national adaptation action plans where they do carry out some kind of an assessment of relative vulnerabilities of different parts of the country. And similar systems are also being introduced at the local government level as part of some of these modalities for devolved financing to local governments. I've been doing reviews in a number of countries. In most places, they are not very advanced. The only place I've seen some professionalism in that has been in Ghana, where you, within the targeted local governments, they actually have been able to use the rainfall data together with the Ghanaian Meteorological Institute, etc., and actually could map out with some technical competency where are the most likely areas for floods and drought, etc., and target climate adaptation finance programming accordingly. So there's some emerging examples in that area that are promising. But I think in all these programs for locally led adaptation, the concerns about local capacity for doing that is a concern, and that's also one of the principles of locally led adaptation, to ensure that you build some institutional capacities among the recipient organizations, not having it driven by external consultancies and so forth. And since I just have the mic, then I can reply briefly to Rolf, and then maybe Beatrice can. The observation that you make that how come in Tanzania, when we look at the data from OECD, a very large share of the projects that are classified by development partners as adaptation finance are actually implemented, at least symbolically, at local government level. How does that correspond to the observations we have that in Tanzania, the system for decentralization is actually not very well developed, and local governments are not very autonomous, and local governments are actually do not have much discretion in terms of managing resources. So first of all, I think the amounts have to be set in perspective. It sounds like a lot, a billion or something like that, but it was over a period from 2013 to 19. And then if you calculate that amount as in per capita per year, then it's only around $1 per capita per year that is going to the local governments. And then it is classified as adaptation finance, but in reality it is to a large extent old wine on new bottles. So for instance, some of the things that I know Beatrice, among others, are looking at is how these projects like the Tanzania Social Action Fund actually are addressing effectively adaptation is an issue. So it's a bit of a it was a surprise to us that so much could be so much of the donor-funded climate change adaptation actually, at least symbolically, went through the budgets of the local governments in Tanzania. And maybe the explanation is that is exactly because they don't have so much autonomy. Then you can, at least on paper, have the project implemented, and you'll still, at central level, be able to exercise control over the priorities.
Thank you. Do you want to add anything, Beatrice?
Yeah, I think Pears already said it everything. What I wanted to just add something small about saying devolving power but not resources. In the books you can see, yes, there's money, a lot of money has been devolved, but the local government, as Pe had said, they don't have power to make decision over those funds. They come tagged with strict guidelines. Even if it's donor-funded projects, some of them come with guidelines even from the donors themselves. They tag the adaptation projects should come with these requirements. So when the central government receives the fund, they also send the same guidelines to the local level. So the local government are just receivers and they don't have any power about the funds.
Thank you very much. Should we have another round of questions? Please shoot. I also have 2 questions myself, but I don't want to take the chair. Please. Ralph again.
Thank you for your answers also. I just conclude that the OECD data on development of finance are not very valuable. I mean, not very reliable then, but I'm not going to go into that. But my other question is on loss and damage funding, and Hans-Peter raised that. That is the big issue in the COP, and it has been for a number of years. And finance might be flowing eventually in a couple of years. And it could be quite substantial additions to the finance we're seeing now in terms of climate finance. Do you see, and this is not directed at any of you, but anyone who wants to answer, do you see any sort of qualitative difference here? Or is it going to be more of the same kind of issues we see in terms of funding patterns, funding issues, political economy issues? Or is it going to be a different kind of funding? So yeah, hope that's clear.
Yeah. I think those would be two questions. I like the question on whether the OECD database is actually... But I think Hans could respond to that, because it's one of the big animals that we've been dealing with. Yes, please, sir.
My name is Ole Terkelsen. I come from DIIS here. I have two questions, I think. You have pointed out that there is ambiguity among actors on what climate adaptation really is. My question to you is, because I didn't hear it, none of the presentations I heard your definition of what it is. So my question is, you don't have to answer that in detail, but do you as a research project have a joint common definition of climate adaptation, what counts as it and what doesn't count? The second question is also about the research project itself. I hear an unspoken assumptions, which I think I would like to ask about. One unspoken assumption is that decentralized management of funds is always good. Is that what the project assumption is? Two, I hear an assumption that one should do adaptation based on what people, civil society organizations think. My question to you is that a basic assumption? And I'm asking that because we have a climate minister here in Denmark who say, we don't want to do anything unless 80% of the population is for it. So my questions are really about the research project itself.
Thank you very much. We have another question here.
My name is Mette Vistia. I'm an independent consultant. I want to ask about the capacity of local governments. You have indirectly said that they are not capable of handling climate funds, but I wonder, have you spoken to them or have you interviewed them? What do you build this? It's not an assumption, but what do you build it on?
All right, thank you. That would be Jamal.
Maybe last one.
Thank you, and thank you very much for very interesting, very insightful presentations. My name is Christina Anderskov, and I'm a program manager with the Danish Environmental Protection Agency under the Danish Minister of Environment. I'm responsible for our engagement in Kenya on environment and water. Next week, we will start designing a new strategic sector cooperation between Denmark and Kenya on water. And in my opinion, we cannot say water without saying climate change adaptation. It will last for 10 years. We've got a lot of time. We don't have a lot of money, but we do have a lot of time. And that's why I'm here today, because I've got one question for you, especially Kenyan presenters, but everybody's welcome. If you had all the power in the world and you could do one thing, a national level, that would ensure that climate change adaptation actually happened at a local level, what would that one thing be? Thank you.
Excellent. Shall we take those? All right, Jamal, we start with you, then Hans-Peter, and then, yeah, please.
Thank you very much. On the issue of capacity of local government authorities, I think that is patently not true, simply because of the sums that are actually involved. They're quite minimal. I mean, it has been shown quite extensively that annually the budget for adaptation actually works out to something like 6% of the overall government budget. And that is a figure that has already been expended in areas such as education, health, public infrastructure, of which are all currently being currently being administered at the local government level. So in terms of the financial systems to absorb the money, in terms of the audit systems, in terms of the personnel to actually oversee implementation, audit, and so on and so forth. They have had more than 20 years of practice to make sure that these systems and institutions are actually in place. So I would like to disagree in the question of capacity. And further, as the discourse on adaptation governance has tried to advance, the issues in relation to locally led adaptation, and if we are going to be firm believers when it comes to local led adaptation, then perhaps it's also about time that we started having more faith in having locally led management of such adaptation projects. So my answer is actually firmly in the no.
Before Millicent, do you want to add something on that? Okay, good. Hans-Peter?
Yeah, thanks. Rolf, you ask about the OECD data. A big limitation is a very strong database in Paris, so it's very useful. If without the OECD, I don't know how we should do that calculations, but it's very weak on local level. There's some marking. You have a decentralized project, you can mark that in the database, but it's really difficult because a lot of the decentralized will also be mainstreamed into energy or water or other sectors. So, and that's why I think it's so fantastic in this research. We both in our teams here have people who can look into the OECD data and find the 40 biggest projects that we now will apply the local-led adaptation 8 principle to the 40 biggest projects in Kenya and Tanzania. I think the fantastic here is then we have resources and good people that can go deeper into the counties, go deeper into selected out of the 40. There might be 5 or 6 selected to go deeper with interviews, field visits. I think that's fantastic. Where OECD ends, I think this project starts with people who go out in the field. This on Ole was, there had never been a definition of mitigation adaptation. You have the Rio Convention, Climate Convention from 1992, there might be some little things. And then the Paris Agreement do not really define and so I think there's simply not been able so far any UN decision, United Nations decision on what is climate finance mitigation or adaptation. And that's why it relies so much on the northern part. The OECD has 35 pages Rio marker and guidelines with a lot of examples. So there I think you find some indirect way you find definitions. If not, you could not tag a lot of examples in the OECD guidelines. The World Bank, that had been in secret internally, but a US NGO in Washington got insight to the guidelines, how the World Bank, they're not using Rio marker. They find out this project is 62%, and then they have internal guidelines. And we made alternative guidelines. We got the guidelines and made it for 78 projects. And we found a difference in tagging of $7 billion per year. So that has made a difference how you use it. I think it's so important in my view that the African Climate Summit this week in Nairobi is first ever of this, and hopefully there will soon be future summits. Last year it was called the Africa Summit in Egypt because that's the same UN, but it was not an Africa Summit. I think now the Africans will come much better prepared for the COP28. So I think hopefully more inputs from these Africa summits.
Could you talk about loss and damage before we go to Esben? Esben, the question was around these assumptions.
Yes, assumptions. We definitely do not have an unspoken assumption that devolution is always good. That is what we are saying is devolved climate change adaptation seem to have a great potential if governed, if it reflects local priorities. But like take the case of Tanzania, where local governments have been stripped of power and had very little finance for the last 20 years. I think it would be disaster just to give them all the money in the sense. I mean, there has to be a long process of developing capacity to manage this money, and I think that's very much what's happening over the last couple of years in Kenya to develop new institutions which are able to reflect local priorities. And I think I strongly believe that there's a huge potential in Kenya to have a much better effectiveness of the use of money. I think effectiveness of using climate change adaptation money right now is frightening low. But on the other hand, we've seen that almost all the climate change adaptation funds have been is an after-tagging process. It's climate change relevant, but it's not the climate change adaptation as a priority is competing with a number of other priorities, and it's only now beginning with the Flocker program and similar. We're beginning to see programs which put climate change adaptation up front over other priorities. So it's a very mixed bag we're looking at.
Right. We have a question.
Maybe the loss and damage, I might say one. Who knows? But I can easily imagine emergency assistance being tagged as loss and damage. It is. All our emergency assistance is loss and damage. That is. I mean, if when we go out and react with Dan Church Ace react to a drought, one could tag that as loss and damage. I mean, I think many of the same kind of issues might appear. I don't see it qualitatively very different. But others might have another opinion.
Before we go to Christina's question, there was a question that Uli also asked. Should adaptation be seen based on what the CSOs say? And I think that was targeted towards you. Should we understand adaptation based on what civil society organizations are saying?
It's a tricky question because I think that adaptation should be understood from what stakeholders say, and this should cut across civil society and government actors as well, and just getting into that at that point of consensus on what the priorities of a country are. And that is what, based on my presentation, is really difficult to get to that middle ground, but just to see what works for a country. And it's a contextualized kind of approach where you see the needs of the country or civil society, because of course there are different interests and sometimes they are competing, and different ideologies as well. And we are talking about actors who have different levels of power as well. So I think it should be from a consensus point of view.
Actually, my question was also going towards the same direction, and it speaks to her question. Is interdisciplinarity actually making it so difficult for us to understand adaptation and even to respond? Is it the governments responding or adapting? Is it the CSOs adapting? Is it the villagers? Is it that household that is adapting? That was the question. But anyway, to go to Christina's question, can a number of you say, because I know it will be different also depending on the disciplines, say there is a project here on water, but the question was very specific. Is there one thing that you would say that we could say that when you mention this, then we have adaptation, that it is something visible, particularly linked to the water project? And we don't want to lose that money. More importantly, we want to make sure that this money has an impact. What is that we do so that there is that impact?
I'll start, and maybe my
everybody
colleagues
can say something.
Yes, okay. So for me, I will strengthen coordination in a way that problem identification starts from bottom up, We identify adaptation needs from the village level, then goes to the ward level, so that the ward level action plans feed into the county level action plans and then into the national level action plan. Because in most cases, we have a national climate change action plan that does not really speak to the needs at the community or the village level. And so if this problem identification is connected from bottom up, and then we have flow of funds that also responds to those needs that have been identified and ensuring that the action plan is then effectively implemented, then we can see some sort of adaptation happening at the local level. Yes.
Good. Judith, one word.
I think
one thing,
integrating nature-based solutions in our actions. I sort of feel, or based on what I so far know, that Kenya has not really explored investments on nature-based solutions, yet that is our huge, like our advantage, and I think that would really change a lot, even when you're talking about, because when you say nature-based solution, you're talking about protection, you're also talking about delivery of that water, and we could benefit a lot both from a rural but also an urban. And we have examples that we're actually exploring in Makueni that are looking at nature-based solutions and how that has actually transformed. But of course, there are issues of capacity, there are issues of financing, which of course probably the finance would help, but generally investments.
All right, good. Any other person? Yeah, please. Because for me, before the microphone comes, is that if you give the money to the state, then there is nothing like adaptation. Because as an anthropologist, communities have responded to changing environments for thousands, if not millions of years. And they know best what they need. Let me not continue.
Thanks, Eric. My name is Edward Mungai. And, following from where Eric is stopping, I think local communities have brilliant ideas. The biggest gap, I think, is also how to fund those ideas. So if I was working on, this strategic cooperation, I think I would focus on, and of course, assuming there is not a lot of money in it, I would probably try to work with the private sector to be able to tap those ideas that the communities are and to fund them. And also because, we believe, and I think this is something you should take to Kenya, that water comes from God. And we do not have business models around water. So if, again, we can use the private sector, working collaboratively, for instance, with the banks, to see how then we can develop those business models, I think you'll be able to help a lot of access in water, because I think the key question is access, number one, for drinking, and secondly, also for other uses. And as you go, Danida have looked at water more from the perspective of, clean drinking water. It goes beyond that. And I think if the collaboration can focus beyond, just drinking water and other uses, I think we'll have made Kenyans to adapt to climate change. Thank you.
Yeah, why I mentioned about the study, simply because water could be water for Nairobi, but we have millions of Kenyans who want that water. So is the government delivering water to the city or to another city that is being constructed just a few kilometers away? Or is it going to a pastoral community up in the north of Kenya, which has also grappled with issues around water? So I think it's good that the signatures are there, but who are you getting to bed with? And I'm not saying this just to show that the government cannot be able to deliver, but let's think broadly what really adaptation would mean. And one other question that I wanted to ask is, are we genuinely, from the global north to the global south, are we genuinely engaging with climate adaptation? Or are we just making it a political discussion? Why is the funds actually being released? Is it just to give something? And from the global south, is it just to make politics out of that? I'm just being told that the snacks are getting cold and the time is running out. Please.
I don't want to drag us away from lunch. I just would say I'll be very worried if we reduce climate change adaptation to a technical fix. it is not a technical issue. It is a political issue, and it's about how local people are dealing with risk relating to their livelihoods, and how then the processes of prioritization are organized in a devolved way is very context specific. I will not write out government as you are doing, and I would not say only private sector either. But I mean, there's a lot of, and many of these contexts, it can also be CSO for that sake, is very context specific. But what we need is mechanisms to get more of these $100 billion out to the local unit, subnational unit, and even more importantly, or similarly importantly, get decision making to introduce a subsidiarity principle where decisions that can be devolved are devolved.
Okay.
Thanks.
Any closing remarks before, of course, for the team before I give you the floor?
No, I'm just say thank you for all participating and presenting and being here today, and we can mingle and talk out for that sandwich is outside the door.
All right, thanks.
Thanks.